This is the second part of the story. You can see the first part by following the link in the description. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. The officer took a deep breath, as if trying to gather the courage to speak. You see, this is the third case like this in our town. We've kept this information under wraps. Our forensic experts are baffled. But a third case in such a short time means only one thing. It's a pattern. This can't be a coincidence, he said, his voice tinged with unease. John interrupted him, leaning slightly forward. Can you tell us more about the other victims? The officer nodded and continued. It started 2 weeks ago. Forest rangers reported finding a man's body in the woods. His body was badly mutilated, and we initially thought he'd been attacked by a wild animal. But during the autopsy, it became clear that the injuries were self-inflicted. He paused, lowering his gaze for a moment before continuing. A week later, we got another call. A woman reported strange screams coming from the house next door. They'd been going on for hours. When we arrived, we found only a body. The man was already dead, and his injuries, they were eerily similar to the ones on the first victim. A chill ran down my spine. What had initially seemed like isolated incidents was now forming a disturbing and sinister pattern. I began summarizing everything we knew so far. So here's what we've got, I said, mostly to myself. 3 people who are literally tearing themselves apart, something that shouldn't even be possible. One of them is in the ward now, unconscious. I turned to John. John, how soon will the patient regain consciousness? Should be this evening, he replied, glancing at his watch. Then he'll be able to answer many of the questions we've got, I added. The officer, standing quietly nearby, spoke up. Guys, let me know as soon as he wakes up. I'll come back to talk to him, he said, his tone calm but firm. We said our goodbyes to the officer and headed with John to the hospital cafe for some coffee. The atmosphere was still heavy, but a cup of coffee was the only thing that might help settle our nerves for now. Listen, I said, turning to John. This can't be a virus, can it? John shook his head. No, if it were, we'd all be infected by now, including the police and everyone else who came into contact with these people. Could it be a psychological disorder? John suggested, staring thoughtfully into his cup of coffee. No, I replied, shaking my head firmly. Disorders like that are extremely rare, and they don't lead to something this horrifying. And now we have 3 people with the exact same symptoms. We fell silent, each lost in thought as we finished our coffee. Then we headed back to the patient's room. I'll stay here, I said as we entered, just in case he wakes up sooner than expected. All right, John agreed. I'll go check on the other patients. He left, leaving me alone in the room. I settled into a chair next to the patient's bed, watching his motionless body and wondering what terrifying truth might be lurking behind this story. I took out my notebook, intending to reread everything Fred had told me. Maybe I missed some crucial detail. As I flipped through the pages, I suddenly heard a faint groan. It was Fred. He was regaining consciousness. I quickly grabbed my phone and called John. Get to the room, fast. The patient is awake. Hanging up, I leaned over for Fred. Can you hear me? I asked. With barely audible effort, Fred whispered 2 words, brick factory. At that moment, John burst into the room. Fred repeated the words a couple more times, but didn't respond to any of our questions. Then he slumped back into unconsciousness. Brick factory? We need to call the officer, I said, turning to John. John pulled out his phone and quickly briefed the officer. After a short conversation, he looked at me. There's only one brick factory in town. It's up north. The officer is heading there now. I nodded but hesitated for a moment. I remember back when I was a kid, there was another factory down south. It's been demolished for years, but it had massive underground cellars and tunnels. Stay with Fred, I said. I'll head there and check it out, just in case. John frowned. Why rush? It'll be dark soon. Let's go together tomorrow. Fair enough, I agreed. I'll just take a quick look from a distance. See if there's anything unusual. John sighed, but didn't argue further. I drove for about 15 minutes. It was already dark, but the bright moonlight illuminated the area, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. I parked my car not far from the ruins of the factory and decided to step out for a cigarette while taking a closer look at the site. Lighting up, I spotted a figure in the distance. The person was moving toward the cellars of the abandoned factory. Maybe it's just a homeless person? I thought, but something about their movements felt deliberate, too purposeful to dismiss. Deciding to investigate, I cautiously followed, making sure to stay unnoticed. The hardest part was closing the gap without revealing myself, but I managed to stay hidden while keeping him in sight. The figure reached the cellar, glanced around briefly, and climbed inside. He didn't look like a homeless person. His actions were too calculated. Perhaps a drug addict or a dealer? Either way, something felt off. I pulled out my phone to call John and fill him in, but there was no signal. Fine, I muttered under my breath. I'll have to check this out myself. The entrance to the cellar was wide and spacious, littered with debris from the collapsed building. I scanned my surroundings. There were plenty of places to hide if things went south. Steeling myself, I followed the suspicious figure into the dark depths of the cellar. Walking through the dark, damp corridor of the basement, I saw a faint light at the end of the tunnel. My heart started racing, but I kept moving forward until I reached it. What I saw next stopped me in my tracks. A massive underground room stretched out before me. Inside, there were about 24 people lying on beds. Each of them had medical tubes inserted into their veins, and blood was being drained into large containers. What the hell is going on here? I whispered to myself, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my spine. My first instinct was to take a picture of what I was seeing, but when I pulled out my phone, I realized it was completely dead. Perfect, I muttered under my breath, fighting the panic rising within me. I needed to get out of there, and fast, without letting anyone know I'd been there. I carefully made my way back outside. Fear clung to me like a second skin as I retraced my steps. Finally reaching my car, I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed a man walking slowly toward the road in the distance. His unhurried demeanor seemed almost unnatural in this eerie setting. Should I offer him a ride back to town? I thought, though every instinct inside me screamed to avoid any further involvement. I decided to take a long detour to avoid revealing that I had been nearby all along. The man was slowly walking along the road toward town. I stopped the car and politely offered him a ride. He agreed. He didn't look well, pale and weak, which wasn't surprising if he'd lost as much blood as I suspected at that cursed factory. We started talking. He mentioned that he worked at a pharmacy. I listened casually, all the while thinking about how to steer the conversation toward what I really wanted to know. Finally, I asked, "So where were you coming from?" He visibly tensed. His gaze shifted nervously, as if he didn't know what to say. Realizing I needed to ease the tension, I decided to take an unexpected approach. "Listen," I said with a slight grin, "I've been having this horrible itch lately. Sometimes I feel like I might start biting myself. Can you imagine? And the doctors can't do anything about it. Maybe you could recommend some strong sleeping pills?" The man turned to me, his face a mix of shock and something darker. Then, his expression hardened. "Medications won't help you," he said quietly, his tone almost lifeless. "Most likely, your days are numbered." A chill ran through me. He clearly knew something about what was happening, and that factory was definitely tied to this strange illness. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't worry," he replied, his tone suddenly almost soothing. "I have the same problem. There's only one way to help you." I slammed on the brakes, turned to face the passenger, and looked him straight in the eye. "Tell me what the hell is going on here?" I demanded. He sighed, lowering his gaze as if trying to gather his thoughts. "Where do I even start?" he muttered. "These are some kind of unknown parasites. They can't be detected by any medical tests. Physically, only the host can see them. No one knows where they came from. But there's a woman. She does experimental medicine. She mixes something in a solution and gives it to us to relieve the symptoms. But you have to drain a portion of your blood first." I listened carefully, trying to process what he was saying. "And this happens at the factory?" I asked. "Yes, not far from where you picked me up," he confirmed. "How did you find out about the factory?" I asked, watching him closely. "It started when I began having a terrible itch," he replied, avoiding my gaze. I didn't even notice that I was scratching my skin raw during work. One of the pharmacy customers pointed it out to me. He came to buy medical tubing and noticed my hands. That's when he told me about the factory. Every word he spoke made the situation feel more ominous. This story was getting darker and more horrifying by the second. "So I take it your group meets there every evening?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Yes, but don't tell anyone," he replied cautiously. "This kind of treatment is illegal in our country. If the woman helping us gets caught, she'll go to prison, and people like us will be left without any help." I nodded to avoid raising suspicion and dropped him off in town. Without wasting any time, I headed straight to the hospital to see John. As I pulled up, I spotted my furious friend standing near the entrance, pacing back and forth. The moment he saw my car, he started jogging toward me. That's when I remembered my phone was dead. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath as I parked the car. I stepped out and moved toward John, trying to cut him off with the important information I had before he could unleash his frustration. "John, listen, I've found something. It's important, just hear me out." I began, but his expression made it clear he was ready to let me have it. On the way to the hospital, I told John everything I had learned. He was stunned. Despite being doctors with a strictly scientific approach to everything, we were both on the brink of accepting something beyond the realm of reason. "This sounds like some kind of insane supernatural nonsense," John said when I finished. "But honestly, there's a terrifying logic to it." "Yeah, but if we miss something, it could end in disaster," I replied, trying to stay focused. When we reached the hospital, John updated me on Fred's condition. "He's in a coma now. His condition is severe but stable," he said. "And the officer?" I asked. "He didn't find anything suspicious at the factory he went to," John replied, shaking his head. "The pressure was mounting, and we knew time was running out. We called the officer, shared the new information, and arranged a meeting to devise a plan of action. We can't keep handling this alone," I told John after the call. "It's getting too dangerous." The officer arrived surprisingly quickly. We all understood that, in this situation, we could only trust each other. The tension in the room was palpable, but determination was clear on everyone's face. "I've got an idea," I began, taking a deep breath. "I'll go down into the cellars and pose as a new patient. I'll try to figure out what's really happening, meet this mysterious woman, and find out why they need human blood." I turned to John. "John, you'll stay nearby, outside, keeping an eye on the situation. If anything goes wrong, you'll be able to step in or signal for help." Then I looked at the officer. "And you'll be on standby. If we need armed support, you can step in, but the key is not to blow your cover too soon." The officer nodded, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "It's risky, but we don't have many other options," he said. "The risk is worth it if we can uncover the truth," I replied, trying to project confidence. The plan was dangerous, but it was the only way to infiltrate this secretive operation and get the answers we needed. Part 3 will be out very soon. Like us and subscribe so you don't miss new videos.